Morning, people. It's Thursday morning. Hope you have a great and fantastic day. And we talk about strength, loving the Lord your God with all your strength. We've dealt with some of the facts that the strength that you have is given from God to be used for the purpose of God. You have all the strength that you need to fulfill the purpose of God. You don't need to ask for any more because God has given it to you. And when we ask God for strength, what we're really saying is, God, I've made a choice to use the strength that you have already given to me. There's a paradox that Paul brings us to, and I'm sure many of you have been thinking about this one. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul says this. He says, and he speaks of a thorn in his flesh. We're not always sure what it is. There's different people surmise, but it was something that Paul didn't like, something that he felt he could do without. And he prayed 3 times, he says, for God to remove the thorn in the flesh. And God says this, but my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. You see, the truth of the matter is that God uses weak people. Some of us, I think, are just too strong for God to use, because we use our own abilities, we use our own talents, and we think that we're using them for God. Well, that may or that may not be true. Only you will know that. But when we use our strengths for ourselves, we find ourselves in a place where glory is all about us. And the reason that God chooses to use weak people is all about that. You see, God is very intentional about us not touching His glory. God is and He's not being egotistical at all. God is just being God. He says, don't touch my glory, it belongs to me. And when we take God's glory and we try and piggyback on it, or try and get a little bit of God's glory for ourselves, we find ourselves in a lot of trouble, and that power can be taken from us. The great example would be, and sadly, of Moses. Moses had the most remarkable story of success and utilizing and understanding the power of God. He had to get over that victim's mentality where he kept saying, I can't do this and I can't speak. And we've said already, God cannot use anybody with that mentality. But Moses came out of that and was greatly used of God. But one day in Numbers chapter 20, Moses went against what God had wanted for him. Children of Israel were thirsty. And so Moses went, said of the children of Israel to God, they're thirsty again. So God says, I want you to speak to that rock over there, and out of that rock will come water. And Moses went across the rock, called all the children of Israel to watch this, because he was confident God was going to come through. And then Moses blew it. He hit the rock, not once, but he hit it twice. And God looked at this, and although God was gracious and gave them the water, Moses lost his blessing of going into the promised land, of seeing everything that God had promised. And we would say, that's a mere technicality. It doesn't matter what it is, people. It touched the glory of God. And we have often said in our church, when God stands center stage, He stands alone. Nobody stands with Him. Even if your name is Moses, you don't get to stand with God on center stage. He stands alone. And Moses touched the glory of God, and he thought, I could just do this in my own strength. The outcome was the same, but only God and Moses knew what the problem was. People, you don't want to touch God's glory. It belongs to Him. And isn't that maybe one of the reasons why God chooses to use weak things? Because when a weak thing achieves great things for God, then God is able to smile and say, I did that. I used a weak vessel. You just happened to be the person that I used to get that. And I have received my glory, and I've chosen to use it at the point of your weakness. What a great privilege. Like a paradox. When you are weak, then you are strong. And when we are weak in ourselves, but strong in God, that's a different story. But in that passage, it says that my grace is sufficient for you. Many people think that grace just gets you to heaven. It's grace that brings you forgiveness. You see, God doesn't forget sin, He forgives sin. And it's that grace that brings to us that forgiveness of sin. And there's more of it. That's just one aspect of grace, but the other aspect of grace is what he's talking about here. Where the other aspect of grace is that power within us to be everything that God wants us to be and to do everything that God wants us to do. Grace just doesn't save us for heaven, but it saves us for service down here and gives us the power to fulfill that which God has ordained for us to do. So as we go into today, let's go in knowing God has given us amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Take nothing away from that grace. It's huge, it's awesome, and indeed it is amazing. But God has given you grace as well to overcome all of the thorns in the flesh that you have and all of the challenges of your life. And ultimately that grace is given so you can be what God wants you to be, and you can do everything that God wants you to do. Won't you revel in His grace today and thank Him for it? Have a wonderful one.